joining me now is a man with a very distinguished career, also working in Washington. His name is Peter Wallison. He goes back into the Reagan administration. He was general counsel of the U.S. Treasury Department during the Ronald Reagan administration. He has been a member of several different councils, Council to President Ronald Reagan from 86 to 87, member of the Advisory Committee on Improvements to Financial Reporting, U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission from 2007 to 2008. He served as a member of the Shadow Financial Regulatory Committee from 1991 through 2009. He was a co-chair of the Financial Reform Task Force and also, in the subject of this interview, a member of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, from which he authored his own minority opinion, which conflicted with the opinions, I believe, of the majority and the Republican majority, because I believe there were three separate opinions. Correct, Peter?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so first, could you give me a little background on this committee and how it was convened and how the hearings were held? Because I know I wanted to be a witness. I kept contacting the Republicans, trying to volunteer, because I said, look, I predicted the crisis. I wrote books about it. I did speeches about it. I warned about it. I forecast all these things, the bankruptcy of Freddie and Fannie, the collapse of the financial institutions. I warned about the housing bubble for years before it blew up. And I couldn't get anywhere near this committee. So give us a little background on how it was set up.
I didn't know about this, Peter. I didn't know you were trying to contact the committee. But I'm not at all surprised that you were not interviewed. They interviewed 700 people. 700 people. You were not included. This is a real joke. Did
any of those 700 people forecast the crisis in advance?
No. And, the whole thing was cooked, I'm afraid. And it really is. It's very, very sad because they did not attempt, really, to, even from the very beginning, to get to the bottom of what caused the financial crisis. And they really wanted, and what they produced, ultimately, and I'm talking here about the six Democrats. Let me step back just a moment so I can give your listeners and you some background on this. There were 10 appointees to the commission, 6 Democrats, 4 Republicans. Of the 3 Democrats appointed by the Senate majority leader, 3 appointed by the Speaker of the House, and in the case of the Republicans, 2 appointed by the minority leader of the House, 2 appointed by the minority leader of the Senate. I was one of those appointed, and I was appointed by the minority leader of the House, who happened to be John Boehner, now, fortunately, the Speaker of the House. Mm-hmm. The effort, of course, was to inquire into and discover the cause of the financial crisis. This was a very unique event. Nothing like this had happened since the Depression, and even the Depression wasn't like this. This was actually closer to the financial panic of 1907 than it was to the Depression, because it occurred solely within the financial community and then spread eventually into a major recession. But the idea was to find the cause of the financial crisis. And I'm afraid, and your experience is another little bit of evidence that proves that the thing was cooked from the beginning. The idea was simply to confirm the narrative that the Democrats had been using all along to adopt the Dodd-Frank Act, which they adopted in July of 2010, and that is that what this economy needed was more regulation. And the reason we had a financial crisis is that there was not enough regulation. And that's where the whole thing went from the beginning. So I guess I'm not surprised they didn't interview you.
So it's interesting. So what regulations do they think, extra regulations that could have been in place? Because there were already so much regulation in the financial. So what additional regulations would have made a difference?
Well, that's a really good question, but what you can do is you can say there were sections of the economy that were not sufficiently regulated. We know that banks were very heavily regulated. They had no explanation for why the banks, which were very heavily regulated, got into such trouble. But what their idea was is you actually have to extend the regulation to other parts of the financial system, principally the investment banks like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and others. They weren't sufficiently regulated. And you really have to make sure that you are regulating all of the major players in the financial world. Now,
here's one thing. Let me just stop you real quick, because this asked your comment on this. What strikes me as so crazy about that is the entities that needed the biggest bailouts were the banks that were regulated, but the hedge funds that weren't regulated, none of them got bailouts.
Yes.
And of course, and then Freddie and Fannie, which were government-sponsored enterprises, had the biggest losses of them all. And this was a government's own creation.
All true, and things that were actually brought to their attention. Now, I must say that it was not the responsibility of this commission to propose any actions, any public policy actions. The purpose of the committee was simply to find the causes. But as we know, I mean, logically, the causes would lead to the actions. So they have produced a story about the financial crisis that justifies the actions that Congress had already taken. And my dissent was fundamentally to say you missed the entire picture. You missed what caused the financial crisis. In fact, you didn't even try to find out what caused the financial crisis.
I read your dissent, and I recommend that people. It's on the internet, so if you want to read the entire opinion, it's there. In fact, you could read the other ones online as well. But let me ask you: Did you arrive at your conclusions, which are in general correct? But were you able to arrive at that based on the evidence and the testimony that was before the committee, or did you have to go way outside the scope of the committee and do your own research to come to these conclusions?
I had to go outside completely. What the commission was doing was largely irrelevant to the entire question of the cause of the financial crisis. My conclusion was that we first had to understand why there were so many very weak mortgages in our financial system. What the one thing that is different was different in 2008 from anything that went before is that in 2008, half of all mortgages in the U.S. financial system were subprime or otherwise high risk. Half of all mortgages. That means they had low down payments.
Why do you think that was?
That was because of government policy, particularly requirements placed on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to require them to buy what were called affordable housing loans. And those were basically loans to people, mortgages to people at or below the median income in the place.
So even though they couldn't, so even though these were not conforming loans by the standards that Freddie and Fannie had, they still were required to go into the market and buy these loans anyway, even though they didn't meet the basic requirements of Fannie and Freddie conforming mortgages.
Exactly. What happened here is that it reduced underwriting standards. Underwriting standards had formerly kept out bad loans. The affordable housing requirements required Fannie and Freddie to go into the market and buy those loans. And as soon as you have these enormous buyers in there, and they were the biggest buyers by far in the market, as soon as you had them in there saying to people in the market, look, you can make any kind of loan, we'll buy it as long as it is
basically the government required Fannie and Freddie to buy bad mortgages. They didn't exist, and so the market created them specifically so they can sell them to Freddie and Fannie.
Exactly.